The United States Supreme Court refuses to do its job to protect the disadvantaged, to protect the disenfranchised, to protect those most vulnerable in our society. That was the role of the United States Supreme Court as created by our framers, by our founding fathers. But this Supreme Court, MAGA, right, alt-right, extreme, they refuse that remit. They refuse to protect our civil liberties and those of fellow Americans that deserve it most. And with a new ruling that attacks and undermines the transgender community, the youth of America, those that have a disconnect between who they see themselves as and what their bodies are and what their gender is. This attack on the transgender community cannot stand. But it is something that we need to address, and we do it on Legal AF, a crossover edition. Legal AF meets Unprecedented with Dina and me, Michael Popok, and here's a clip. So let's turn to transgender rights. You did a great job originally talking about the Scrimeti oral argument on Unprecedented on Legal AF YouTube channel. Why don't you pick up for what was at stake, what was the ruling, and then we can turn and talk about Justice Sotomayor in her sorrowful dissent.
Yeah, the Supreme Court heard this oral argument back in December. So if you listened along with us, this is when we were talking about it. This is a law in Tennessee, but there are 22 or 20 other states that have very similar laws that have now all theoretically been upheld, right? Obviously, each one didn't go in front of the Supreme Court, but because the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Tennessee, this is not just confined to Tennessee. We're talking about 22 or 23 other states where the most vulnerable community, transgender communities, have been stripped of their rights. Let's talk about it. That's the reality. And it was really disappointing when I was listening to the oral argument, Justice Amy Coney Barrett. I mean, we know she goes with the majority and, the Christian more value. I don't even want to say that this is a Christian value case, because personally, I think this is against Christian values, but her type of Christianity, let's say, we know she tends to rule in favor of, that she would be with the majority. But she brought up a question that gave me a little bit of hope, which was, what about the rights of the parents, right? And she has so many kids herself. She adopted so many kids. And I thought, oh, maybe this was a glimmer of hope. And no, sure enough, it wasn't. It was a 6-3 decision. It was Ketanji Brown Jackson and Sotomayor and Kagan that dissented. The rest were in lockstep. And basically the question was, the law outlawed hormone blocking pills, non-surgical treatments that a doctor prescribes to a child who feels like they are born in a body that they do not biologically identify with, right? And that's the thing here. We're talking about not only parents making this decision for their children, but the doctors. People cannot get this treatment unless a doctor is prescribing it. And these laws are basically taking away the healthcare choices of these families and the doctors. And the sad situation is a lot of times, I mean, I know families who have gone through this, transitioning, and it is usually excruciating for the family. Oftentimes the child is severely depressed, severe anxiety when they have this disconnect of not being in their own body. And oftentimes the hormone treatments and other treatments they give them save their lives. They feel suicidal, these children. So this is a radical decision, taking away the rights, the healthcare rights of this family. How they legally did it is they had to decide whether or not the law would have a rational basis review or a strict scrutiny review. Obviously, the rational basis review is a lot less. And the standard is whether or not the law rationally is related to a legitimate government interest. I mean, that's like the easiest to say. So the Supreme Court said, yes, this was democratically decided. They had a legitimate government interest in deciding what laws to have relating to transgender children. It was rationally related. Of course, Sotomayor in her dissent, said, this is kind of ridiculous. She doesn't use that word, but basically that's what she's saying. This should be strict scrutiny. And a strict scrutiny, they would most likely, this law would not have met that test. But the court didn't even go into whether or not it would have met that test because they decided it just needed the lower. And I'm going to just quote what she says. She says, related to this decision, quote, that marks the first time in 50 years that this court has applied such deferential review normally employed to assess run-of-the-mill economic regulations to legislation that explicitly differentiates on the basis of sex. And so now we have Dobbs basically doing the same thing, saying the government, in certain states can decide the healthcare choices of a woman who is pregnant. And now the Supreme Court saying the government can decide the healthcare choices for transgender youth. And it is, when she read it from the bench today, she ended with, in sadness, I dissent. And I concur. And I think a lot of us all here on Midas and Legal F concur. It's a very sad day. The Supreme Court basically upholding an attack on the most vulnerable communities in America.
The Supreme Court used to be the place of refuge to protect the downtrodden, the disadvantaged. It is no longer. It is the place to protect the wealthiest, the most advantaged people. It seems to only exist to benefit an out-of-control imperial president. It doesn't care about women. It doesn't care about the LGBTQ plus community. It seems to exist in a vacuum where none of these, and I know it's impossible, none of these 6 MAGA right-wing judges, ones that try to call themselves moderate when they're not, none of them seem to have anybody in their life that is in that community. The way they rule, because they pay lip. John Roberts actually had the balls, to pay lip service to. Well, we're not saying that transgender people shouldn't be protected in other contexts. We're just saying here, when it comes to healthcare and when it comes to pre-puberty or puberty issues, we think that's better left as a political question to the electorate of each individual state, and we're not going to find a federal constitutional protection over these people. It's the same thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, to say we're going to leave it to the we're not. This is like saying, I'm trying to come up quickly with this analogy or this. It's like saying we're not saying that we're not going to protect somebody who's left outside to the wolves. We're just not going to open the door when they're knocking on it. And let's see what happens. Well, I know what's going to happen. I know what happens when there's a pack of wolves outside and a disadvantaged animal or person is on one side of the door and not the other. So don't yank my chain, right? Don't pee down my leg and tell me that it's raining. Okay? Which is what Roberts is doing. Because there's another decision where they ruled that in discrimination in the workplace, that they would protect gay and transgender people, but they didn't extend it to this because, well, it's science again. We're back to abortion. It's reproductive in science. We'll leave it to the legislatures. Legislatures, in half of our states, women are second-class citizens who don't have reproductive rights or rights over bodily autonomy at all, right? And if they're not wealthy, they can't shoot out to another state, like a blue state. And in some of their states, it's a criminal act if they do, to try to get the reproductive care and health care that they want. So don't tell me, they all sit there with this it's the smugness that galls me, and not worrying about what the impact is going to be on transgender kids. It's just.
Yeah, I know. I mean, the idea that somehow, the majority rules, right? Like it's a democratic process. It kills me because the minority, whatever that minority group is, will never be protected in that process, right? And we've seen that over the years, right? I mean, this is why we had to have the Supreme Court step in with all of their racial protections and civil rights protections. And it's like you said, it's the smugness, it's the entitlement. I still always remember Justice Kavanaugh in the oral argument for Dobbs, and he just said, why not just leave it for the states? And I thought, you have never, ever had your rights questioned if you feel so okay with having the political process protect your rights. But when you are a minority, you can't, trust the majority. We've seen over and over and over. And here, the transgender community, so few people have ever met somebody who's transgender, talked to somebody who's transgender. The Republicans have been able to use it as a lightning rod conversation, and definitely fear mongering and othering and all of that stuff. There is no hope for them in the political process. And the Supreme Court lives in our world. They may sit in their robes on that court, but they watch TV like the rest of us, and they hear the campaigning like the rest of us. And them doing it in this climate, knowing the political process is acting as if transgendering is some horrible evil, makes this ruling even more disgusting to me. Popok,
couldn't put it any better than that. So look, that's what we do on Legal AF. That's what we do on the Midas Touch Network. We don't blow smoke or sunshine. I'd like to sugarcoat this and say there's a silver lining, and it's not, all hope is not lost when it comes to this United States Supreme Court doing its job that they were appointed to a lifetime position to do. But it's decisions like this that remind us again that elections have consequences. And I know it was a hard equation for some of the Democratic voters to put together, that the president, whether you like them or not on the Democratic side, is the person who picks your federal judges and your United States Supreme Court. I mean, my entire natural born life so far, except for when I was a baby, has been a Republican dominated Supreme Court for 50 plus years. I have never, neither of you, I have never known a time when we had a moderate to liberal majority on the United States Supreme Court. Yeah, they've had the numbers, sometimes 5-4, sometimes 6-3, sometimes 7-2 for my entire day, everything. But I've never been as disappointed and fearful about the United States Supreme Court, except in the last 5 years, the 2 Trump terms and the cases and the precedent that they're setting. There's a reason that you enshrine something in the Constitution, because it should not be a question of mob rule or state decision or up for a vote, because some things are so fundamental to our freedom and our liberty that the Supreme Court needs to declare it and protect it. But this is the same Supreme Court, first one in the entire history of the Supreme Court. The Dobbs decision is about a woman's right to choose, overturning Roe versus Wade, was the first decision. This is what broke the dam, that ever took away a constitutional right that had been granted by a prior Supreme Court. They grant constitutional rights. They had never taken one away. When I saw that, all bets were off about what they were capable of doing.
Absolutely, because they're supposed to follow their own precedent, right? Yeah. And they reversed it for nothing new had happened to justify that. And to your point that elections matter, this is something that we see. Some Democrats are trying to run away from this issue. They think they lost the election over this issue. When I heard Governor Tim Walz speak at the California Democratic Convention just a few weeks ago, he reiterated, we have to not be afraid to say things, because who are we then as a party? And I personally believe we should be not running from this issue, but embracing it. And all the blue dots in those red states, hopefully this motivates you, because maybe you can change one election, reverse something, slow it down. The Supreme Court obviously has so much power, but we might have to make changes in the state legislatures, in Congress, with president. In the meantime, we can't have all be lost. And we cannot, as Democrats, run from this, because to me, I'm like, if we can't protect the transgender community, then to me, I don't understand the party anymore.
Yeah, agreed. Welcome back. Legal AF, 5 years in the making, a podcast. One of the top podcasts at the intersection of law and politics. I proudly co-founded along with Ben Meiselas about 5 years ago. Dina joined me. We did a special crossover episode because on the Legal AF YouTube channel, we have a show we do every week. We've done it for over a year called Unprecedented. And that sits at the intersection of law, politics, and the Supreme Court, giving you everything you need inside and outside the court, from oral arguments to the briefing, to the rulings, to the ethical scandals and pressures on the court, and the court pressuring the American public. We cover it on Unprecedented. Come over to Legal AF, the YouTube channel, hit the free subscribe button. You can tell your friends you're part of the first million on the build of Legal AF, the YouTube channel. Of course, Midas Touch, hit the subscribe button with them, because we're about to roll the odometer over to 5 million, and a large portion of that was contributed by the Legal AF audience and all the work we've done there. So until my next report, I'm Michael Popok. Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.